Okay, back at it again with chapter 3 of Moby Dick, the Spouter Inn. Hopefully you're getting a picture of how I'm going to move through passages with a little bit of a eye towards the different colors of highlighting. Starting out for this chapter, one thing I wanted to comment on is the picture that is in the Spouter Inn, starting in the second paragraph. It says, "But what most puzzled and confounded you was a long, limber, portentous black mass of something hovering in the center of the picture, over three blue, dim perpendicular lines floating in a nameless east. A boggy, soggy, squitchy picture, truly enough to drive a nervous man distracted, yet there was a sort of indefinite, half-attained, unimaginable sublimity about it that fairly froze you to it till you involuntarily took an oath with yourself to find out what that marvelous painting meant. Ever and anon, a bright, but alas, deceptive idea would dart you through. It's the Black Sea in a midnight gale. It's the unnatural combat of the four primal elements. It's a blasted heath. It's a Hyperborean winter scene. It's the breaking up of the ice-bound stream of time." But at last, all these fancies yielded to that one portentous something in the picture's mist. That once found out, and all the rest were plain. But stop! Does it not bear a faint resemblance to a gigantic fish? Even the great Leviathan himself. So I think you can see, if you've been paying attention, the pattern I'm about to draw, which is that this passage seems to discuss the difficulty of interpretation or knowledge, that the object in the painting might be perhaps like objects out in the world or phenomena in the world, where there is this distribution of possible interpretations which humans have access to, but figuring out the right one is difficult because the metaphorical painting is indefinite or half-attained or boggy or soggy or unimaginable. Okay? And of course, this is starting to get associated. These two ideas, the difficulty of interpretation and the whale, are starting to get linked in this symbolic relationship, and that's going to continue. And then we have this weird passage that I really wanted to emphasize. The picture represents a Cape Horner in a great hurricane. The half-foundered ship, weltering there with its three dismantled masts alone visible, and an exasperated whale, purposing to spring clean over the craft, is in the enormous act of impaling himself upon the three mastheads. Just a weird passage. I guess I really should have marked this orange, right? Like, here, let's go like this. Boom, bang, bong. Sorry. It is not cooperating. It doesn't want to do that. I hate this software so much. There you go. I should have marked that orange because that is interesting to me, that it's unclear whether the whale is jumping over the boat in a display of dominance or whether it's committing some form of like ritual suicide. It seems to attribute a sense of agency to a whale that we wouldn't necessarily give it. And if it is trying to commit some ritual act of suicide, why is it doing so? Weird. Something to come back to. So we're going to move further into the chapter where Ishmael starts talking to the owner of the Spouter Inn, or at least the bartender who's selling him his room. And he comes to know that he's going to have to sleep with the harpooner, which we find out is Queequeg. And I just thought that this passage summarized the problem that's going on here, which is I could not help it, but I began to feel suspicious of this dark-complexioned harpooner. At any rate, I made up my mind that if he so turned out that we should sleep together, he must undress and get into bed before I did. So two things. First off, you're going to have a lot of people who write criticism about Moby Dick as having homosexual overtones because of the relationship between Ishmael and Queequeg. I mean, this line kind of complicates that rather simplistic reading with the notion that it's more that Ishmael is wary of of Queequeg than attracted by him. But hey, we're going to look at some other imagery in chapter 4, which might provide a counterpoint. But certainly here, there's the question of knowledge arising again, insofar as Ishmael is suspicious of the harpooner, not only in terms of the harpooner's intent to maybe hurt him or not, hence the take off his clothes so that he can see if he has no weapons, but also this passage seems to abstractly deal with the notion of not understanding or have difficulty in knowing other people's cultures and experiential backgrounds, because it's becoming very clear that wherever this harpooner is from is very different than Ishmael, and he's starting to generate a kind of negative emotion towards that lack of knowledge, that lack of experience, rather than a curiosity. So that goes to a different quote that we'll go to later in the chapter. So, we progress, the sailors come in, etc. I found this passage very funny. It's when Ishmael is trying to sleep and there are no beds, and he tries to sleep on the bench. And the landlord / person running the bar says, Ishmael says, "I shan't sleep with him. I'll try the bench here. Just as you please. I'm sorry I can't spare ye a tablecloth for a mattress, and it's a plaguey rough board here, feeling of the knots and notches. But wait a bit, Scrimshander, I've got a carpenter's plane there in the bar. Wait, I say, I'll make ye snug enough." So saying, he procured the plane, and with his old silk handkerchief, first dusting the bench, vigorously set to planing away at my bed, the while grinning like an ape. The shavings flew right and left, till at last the plane iron came bump against an indestructible knot. The landlord was near spraining his wrist, and I told him for heaven's sake to quit. The bed was soft enough to suit me, and I did not know how all the planing in the world could make eider down of a pine plank. So gathering up the shavings with another grin and throwing them into the great stove in the middle of the room, he went about his business and left me in a brown study. I don't know, I found the idea of the bartender shaving down the wooden bench to make it more apt for sleeping was just too funny and absurd. Classically Melville in well-intentioned but absurd. I'm going to not read this whole passage that starts later in the chapter, but do you remember this passage where Ishmael and the bartender equivocate about the meaning of selling his head? So, Ishmael thinks that the landlord is talking about Queequeg selling his own head, like the head on his shoulders, not a head that he has preserved and cut off. And I could have marked this blue because it's pretty funny. But the relationship to knowledge is more along the lines of the difficulty or an ambiguity of language in communicating meaning, right? Like we get hung up on this question of what does it mean to sell his heads, and if what human beings have to deal with is the difficulty of coming to know the world or expressing inner states, we talked about this in the context of Bartleby, right, like phenomenological independence, then the best we can do is we can communicate with language in order to try to abstract symbolic relationships to experiences that we have. But this is a classic instance of the fact that language is pretty bad at explaining those things, and pretty bad at clearing up issues of knowledge. So you can read the whole thing if you want. Pause the video if you want to remind yourself of the story here, but you get the point. The next passage I wanted to talk about is further into the chapter when Ishmael goes into the room where Queequeg and he will be sleeping, and he tries on Queequeg's clothes, and it says here, "But what is on the chest? I took it up and held it close to the light and felt it and smelt it and tried every way possible to arrive at some satisfactory conclusion concerning it. I can compare it to nothing but a large doormat, ornamented at the edges with little tinkling tags, something like the stained porcupine quills round an Indian moccasin. There was a hole or slit in the middle of this mat, as you see the same in South American ponchos. But could it be possible that any sober harpooner would get into a doormat and parade the streets of any Christian town in that sort of guise? I put it on to try it, and it weighed me down like a hamper, being uncommonly shaggy and thick, and I thought a little damp, as though this mysterious harpooner had been wearing it of a rainy day. I went up in it to a bit of glass stuck against the wall, and I never saw such a sight in my life. I tore myself out of it in such a hurry that I gave myself a kink in the neck. And so, I think obviously you can see the connection here to knowledge or understanding. This is about cross-cultural understanding or cross-human understanding, which is impeded here. And I also found this like a particularly funny image of Ishmael trying on this piece of clothing and being quite flummoxed. And then as we continue on, eventually we have the description of Queequeg as being tattooed and being quite different than Ishmael would expect. And then we have this passage that I put in the discussion question. Ignorance is the parent of fear, and being completely nonplussed and confounded by the stranger, I confess I was now as much afraid of him as if it was the devil himself who had thus broken into my room in the dead of night. In fact, I was so afraid of him that I was not game enough just then to address him and demand a satisfactory answer concerning what seemed inexplicable in him. So I found that a particularly telling passage, that in the last 3 chapters we've been looking at all of these different reoccurring passages about the difficulties of knowledge and the difficulties of understanding, and here we kind of have a consequence of that difficulty, which is fear, right? If we can't understand something, it's easy to be afraid of it, which of course will reach a humorous apex later in this chapter. So I found this passage very funny. Queequeg comes back into the room, or has been in the room, and then eventually it all comes to a head when it says, "But in the interval I spent in deliberating what to say was a fatal one. Taking up his tomahawk from the table, he examined the head of it for an instant, then holding it to the light with his mouth at the handle, he puffed out great clouds of tobacco smoke. The next moment the light was extinguished, and this wild cannibal, tomahawk between his teeth, sprang into bed with me. I sang out," which means to cry out. "I could not help it now, and giving a sudden grunt of astonishment," sorry, I went backwards there, "he began feeling me." So I don't know, I found that funny. Like, he jumps into bed and he can't help himself, right? And Queequeg's a little surprised too, but luckily Peter Coffin comes in and calms things down. And then we have a very different tack taken at the end of the chapter. What's all this fuss I have been making about, thought I to myself. The man's a human being just as I am. He has just as much reason to fear me as I have to be afraid of him. Better to sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. Okay? So, at the end of the day, this failure of understanding can be overcome, and in fact, Ishmael realizes that there is more that he has in common with Queequeg than he does have in difference. And I think that there's something interesting about his ability to overcome his rather, strong initial prejudice. "Landlord," said I, "tell him to stash his tomahawk there, or pipe, or whatever you call it." Apparently he has like some combo tomahawk pipe. "Tell him to stop smoking, in short, and I will turn in with him, but I don't fancy having a man smoking in bed with me. It's dangerous. Besides, I ain't insured." I should have put that one in blue. This being told to Queequeg, he at once complied and again politely motioned me to get into bed, rolling over to one side, as much as to say, "I won't touch a leg of ye." "Good night, landlord," said I, "you may go." I turned in and never slept better in my life. So I think for me, Queequeg and Ishmael seem to represent a rather positive vision of the ability of the human, either intellect or emotions, to create connections and a mutual understanding, even where that understanding seems difficult in the first place. So I think this relationship is a rather positive one, and one of the more uplifting notes that we receive in a rather dour first 3 chapters.